This is a 4-minute audio introduction to a film called The Materials and Techniques of Tudor Portraits. It's from the National Portrait Gallery. The film itself lasts about 4 minutes and offers the chance to watch painting conservator Polly Saltmarsh explore the materials and techniques used by the Netherlandish artist Hans Eworth by recreating his portrait of Queen Mary I. Polly is a white woman in her early 40s with long blonde hair. She is dressed in a white blouse covered by a blue pinafore apron and a grey cardigan with the sleeves pushed up to her elbows. She wears no makeup. She sits at a workbench in an airy studio. The portrait leans on a wooden easel beside her. It was painted in oil on panel in 1554 when Mary Tudor was in her late 30s. It measures 8.5 inches by 6.5 with a plain black wooden frame. The Queen is shown from the waist up. She stares straight at us with bright, almost beady black eyes. She has a pale complexion, a high, broad forehead, and a determined chin. Her thick auburn hair is parted in the centre and drawn back, caught by the bejewelled band of her headpiece. Known as a French hood, it is a couple of inches wide and flattened across the top of her head. The Queen is wearing a stiff bodice of brown velvet with a flared open collar that stands high. It is lined with white linen and modestly trimmed with white lace. It shows off a pearl choker around her neck, from which hangs a gold cross studded with dark blue gems. Pinned to the point of the neckline is a brooch containing a larger blue gem in an elaborate wrought gold setting, from which hangs a teardrop pearl that is bigger than her thumbnail. Her fingers are encrusted with gold rings, again studded with blue gems. In her right hand she holds a red rose, and in her left clasps a pair of gloves. The cuffs of her undershirt are lavishly embroidered with gold and silver thread. The Queen stands against a backdrop of a bottle green curtain that, from the lighter shades of lines dividing it, seems to have been folded into rectangles, and she rests her hands on a low wall made of bricks or tiles glazed in the same bottle green. During the film, Polly goes over a rough pencil sketch of the portrait, following the lines with black paint applied with a very fine brush. Later she fills these outlines in. She creates the paint by ladling powdered pigment onto a tile using a thin, very flexible palette knife. Adding a small amount of linseed oil, she mixes the two with a glass weight which she rotates in a grinding motion. White capital letters on purple spell out National Portrait Gallery. In this film, painting conservator Polly Saltmarsh explores the materials and techniques used by the Netherlandish artist Hans Eworth by recreating his portrait of Queen Mary I.
So my name is Polly Saltmarsh. I'm a paintings conservator here at the gallery, and behind me is the portrait of Mary I by Hans Eworth. Techniques we've used, we've tried to replicate them as closely as possible to what we know of how Tudor art was made. So we've prepared the panel using chalk priming layers. So when you're making a painting, the first step really is to lay out your composition. And artists did this in a number of ways. Often the initial step would be a sitting with the sitter, the person in the portrait, and it would be probably a very limited period of time. So in that time you might make a drawing, and from that drawing you could use that as a pattern. If there was a popular composition or a sitter that people wanted numerous portraits of, they could reuse these patterns. And the transfer process is the method of putting that pattern onto your wooden panel, basically, before you start painting. And what we see in the Mary I painting is we think there is a transfer process. So we see some very well-drawn, carefully drawn lines, but in other areas they're very freely handled. And you can see that in the area of the rose that she's holding, as well in her sleeves, where the artist is not so much necessarily following a pattern, but is being a bit more loose and free. So you can see there's a sort of difference in the mark making being made that helps us understand how it was created. The paints were ground, so using a traditional kind of grinding on a flat surface, so using linseed oil and then adding in the dry pigments and then grinding the pigments together. So you want every single particle of the pigment to be coated in oil so you get a beautiful uniform film. So the pigments that I've used, I've tried to find the most authentic pigments you can get today. Some of the other pigments would have come from all over the world. We've also used earth pigments, so these are pigments that literally, as the name suggests, come from the earth. So a lot of the yellow ochres are clay-like materials, and we also have a lot of browns that come from the earth. And again, these are very common today. They're still readily available in shops. In many of the paints that you buy will have earth pigments because it's cheap. When we were looking at the painting and sort of technical analysis, we looked with the microscope, we also took cross-sections. So we have an understanding of how the artists have built up the paint layers in this painting. And in the reconstruction, I wanted to be faithful to how they've been applied. One of the really interesting things in this painting is how the green curtain fabric has been created. And the artist has laid in quite a dark grey tone in the background, covering all the areas that we now see green fabric. And over the top of that is laid in a copper green glaze. So a glaze is where there's a lot more medium, so it's a much more translucent layer. So when you lay that in over the grey underlayer, you really get this intensity of modulation between light and darks, and you get the highlights. And it's one thing when you're looking at the paintings and understanding it, when you actually try it out yourself and recreate it, you get a much better idea for how it handles and feels and what you can achieve with those different techniques. Making the portrait, I've learned a lot about using these methods. Again, we look at these paintings all the time, we understand the materials and techniques in theory, but when you're actually doing it hands-on, you learn so much. The thing I've learned most is it's really hard to paint on this scale. It's a really tiny painting. I was using brushes that I use in my day-to-day job as a conservator, which are the finest brushes you can buy, and they're still almost too big. So there's so much skill used in trying to create something on this scale. That's my takeaway, that it's really difficult.
Separate frames show us the stages from black outlines, then filled in with colour with details added, and the final painting. White letters on purple invite us to explore the collection, npg.org.uk. Audio description written by Louise Fryer and voiced by Fern Lulham for Vocalise.